One February evening in 1959, in a quiet mountain range, a group of hikers prepared for a routine night. They were elite explorers, and their final photograph showed them smiling in the fading light. Everything looked perfectly secure. Only a heavy silence remained when the rescuers arrived weeks later to find the site. The tent was standing alone in the waste. So the search party moved closer, expecting to find the hikers sleeping or huddling from the wind. Instead, they found the tent shredded from the inside out and a trail of footprints leading into a blizzard. These footprints were made by people wearing only socks or walking barefoot. No one knew that the worst had already happened. 9 people had been claimed by a force that left no trace. Tonight I have one true story for you. It orbits a specific kind of danger that doesn't enter your life with a loud noise or an obvious sign. It arrives in the shape of the thing you least suspect. It can look like safety or the familiar. Sometimes it even looks like kindness. And the most frightening part is that the person standing closest to it is the last one to see it. This video is designed to accompany rain and a very light layer of white noise running steady underneath. You will hear soft, even rain, distant enough to pull your breathing slower and blur everything around you. If it is already late where you are, and your room is quiet, there is a good chance you will drift off soon. If that sounds right, subscribe to the channel. Tell me where you are listening from. The like button is still right there. Quiet, well-behaved, patient, looking completely harmless. At least for now, while it still hasn't given anyone a reason to be suspicious. Go ahead and click it now, just in case tonight it changes its mind, parks right outside your door, and starts monitoring your daily routine from behind the tinted glass. In 1959, on the slopes of Kholat Syakhl, Igor Dyatlov stood in the deepening snow. He and his team of 8 hikers were meticulously pitching their large canvas tent. The sun was dipping below the horizon, and the air was beginning to bite through their heavy layers. They followed a strict routine of securing the poles and smoothing the floor. The group worked with the efficiency of people who had done this dozens of times before. They hammered the stakes deep into the frozen earth to ensure the wind would not carry them away. Igor checked each knot twice before allowing the others to move their gear inside. Everything was moving according to the plan they had written weeks before they left the city. However, there was one detail that did not fit the logic of an experienced mountain team. They had chosen to pitch their tent on a precariously steep and barren incline. A sheltered tree line was clearly visible and easily reachable just 1,500 meters below them. They were completely exposed to the elements on the side of a mountain known as the Dead Place. The hikers were not amateurs looking for a weekend thrill in the cold. They were elite student engineers from the Ural Polytechnic Institute who viewed the world through math. Their journals were filled with technical calculations of incline and gear weight. To them, the mountain was not a mystery to be feared, but a series of solvable equations and physical forces. They treated their expedition with the same rigor they applied to their structural studies. Every gram of food was accounted for, and every kilometer of the trail was mapped out in advance. They trusted in the strength of their equipment and the reliability of their own hands. In their world, if you followed the rules of physics, the environment would always remain predictable. One of the hikers, a young man named Rustam Slobodin, had a specific habit he never missed. Every night before he crawled into his sleeping bag, he meticulously wound his mechanical watch. He took exactly 30 seconds to ensure the tension was perfect for the coming day. That watch would later be found stopped at precisely 8:45 in the evening. Another student named Nikolai Thibault-Brignolles carried a mandolin throughout the entire journey. He had strapped the heavy instrument to his pack and hauled it across 300 kilometers of snow. He intended to play for the group once they reached the final peak of their route. He often hummed the tunes under his breath while he marched through the drifts. A hiker named Yuri Doroshenko was known for his incredible physical strength and his calm demeanor in a crisis. He had a habit of checking the temperature exactly 4 times every evening to track the weather patterns. He kept a small, smooth stone in his pocket that he had found on a previous trip for good luck. He never explained why that stone mattered so much. On their final evening, the group sat inside the cramped tent, and worked on a project. They were writing a satirical newspaper they called the Evening Otorten. It was full of inside jokes about mountain spirits and the quality of their freezing soup. They laughed together as they passed the pen around, feeling the warmth of their shared struggle against the cold. A woman named Lyudmila Dubinina was known for her quiet focus and her attention to the small things. She always tapped the wooden table 3 times when she was thinking, a habit she did not even notice she had. She had just put down a deposit on her first solo trip to the coast for the following summer. That trip was a dream she spoke of often. The air inside the tent smelled of wet wool, tobacco smoke, and the faint scent of kerosene. They had hung their outer coats on a line near the entrance to dry out from the day's sweat. It was a scene of domestic peace in one of the most hostile environments on the planet. They felt the safety of the canvas walls and the presence of their close friends. The mountain outside was a vast and indifferent expanse of white and gray shadows. The wind moved across the peaks with a sound like a low, rolling thunder that never quite faded. It was a space that did not care about the engineers or their calculations of safety. The hikers were a small point of light in a landscape that was designed to extinguish it. Each sensory detail inside that space carried the weight of a life that was still in progress. The sound of the stove hissing and the rustle of the maps being folded were the background noise of their reality. They could not hear the mountain shifting outside or the way the air was beginning to change. They were focused on the warmth and the light of their small fire. As the night progressed, the wind outside began to shift its tone. It was no longer a steady roar, but a low-frequency vibration that seemed to bypass the ears and hit the chest. The fabric of the tent began to hum with a strange, rhythmic energy. Igor noted the worsening weather in his final log entry, describing the slope as uninviting and the air as heavy. He paused for a moment, listening to the way the mountain seemed to be speaking to them. He looked at the faces of his friends and decided that they would stay put despite the feeling in the air. He convinced himself that staying on the slope was a good way to practice their high-altitude camping skills. He chose to ignore the prickling sensation on his skin. Something happened inside that tent while the hikers were in the middle of changing for sleep. There was no warning and no time to gather their survival gear or their boots. An inexplicable event forced the 9 students to make a decision in a matter of seconds. They did not reach for the entrance flap, which was the only way out of the shelter. Instead, a knife was drawn from a belt and used to slash through the thick canvas walls. They cut 3 large holes from the inside out to create a path for immediate escape. This was not a calculated exit, but a move of pure desperation. They were trying to get away from something that was already inside the space with them or pressing against the door. 9 people fled into a negative 30-degree blizzard without their coats or their shoes. They ran down the slope toward the distant woods in their socks and thin undergarments. They abandoned their lanterns, their food, and their only hope for survival in the middle of the night. They were moving away from the camp as if the mountain itself had turned into a furnace. The group reached a large cedar tree at the edge of the woods, 1,500 meters away. They attempted to start a fire with frozen branches to ward off the lethal cold. At this stage, they still appeared to be following a shred of logic. They believed they could wait for the danger to pass and eventually return to the tent to retrieve their supplies. The conditions under the tree were horrific as the wind whipped around the trunk. The temperature continued to drop, and the snow was so thick they could not see their own hands. They huddled together to share the warmth of their bodies, but it was not enough to stop the shivering. The silence of the forest was broken only by the sound of their shallow breathing. But the fire was small, and the wind was relentless in the dark. 2 of the men succumbed to exposure at the base of the tree, their bodies freezing where they sat. The remaining hikers realized that the fire would not save them, and they split into 2 groups. Their decisions were no longer based on engineering, but on the raw instinct to keep moving. 3 of the hikers, including Igor himself, began to crawl back up the slope on their hands and knees. They were trying to reach the tent against a gale that was strong enough to knock a person over. They were found weeks later in a line, each one closer to the camp than the last. They had died from the cold while reaching for the shelter they had abandoned. The final 4 hikers retreated further into the woods to find a ravine where they could dig a snow den. They hoped the earth would provide the protection the canvas could not. However, they soon realized that the nature of their problem had changed completely. The cold was no longer the primary threat as a secondary force arrived in the silence of the ravine. When the rescuers found the tent weeks later, they were baffled by the scene of organized chaos. The lantern was still sitting on top of the blankets, and a plate of food was laid out as if for dinner. The search party initially thought the group had simply gotten lost in the fog, but as they began to recover the bodies, the simple explanation fell apart. Forensic analysis of the hikers' clothing revealed strange traces of radiation that should not have been present. The autopsies of the final 4 victims showed horrific internal injuries that defied standard mountain accidents. They had fractured skulls and pulverized ribs that looked like the result of a high-speed car crash. Yet there was not a single bruise on their skin. One of the women was discovered lying in the stream at the bottom of the ravine. She was missing her tongue, and her eyes had been removed from her head. The investigators noted that the snow around her was undisturbed by any struggle or animal tracks. It was as if she had been hit by a hammer that only struck the inside of her body. The most chilling detail was the trail of footprints leading away from the tent. There were no tracks of military vehicles, no sign of local tribes, and no animal prints in the area. The only marks in the snow belonged to the 9 victims themselves. They had walked calmly and in a single file down the slope toward the place where they would eventually die. The evidence suggested they were not being chased by a physical person or a predator they could see. They were moving away from a threat that was invisible and all-encompassing. The climax of their struggle happened in the darkness of the ravine, where the air itself seemed to turn into a weapon. They were struck by a wave of pressure that shouldn't exist. The Soviet government abruptly closed the case and classified the files for several decades. They released a final statement that blamed the deaths on a compelling unknown force. No names were given to the cause, and no further investigation was permitted by the state. The truth was buried in a vault, along with the broken mandolin and the stopped watches. The site was barred from public access, and the mountain was left to the silence of the winter. The belongings of the hikers were eventually placed into a locked archive in the city. The mandolin remained unplayed, and the unfinished dream of a trip to the coast was never realized. These ordinary objects are all that remains of the 9 students. The wilderness does not need to explain itself to the people it chooses to keep. It waits on the high slopes for the next group to arrive with their maps and their equations. It reminds us that our logic is only a thin canvas against a force we cannot name. The mountain stays quiet, while the snow covers the tracks of those who tried to outrun it. In 1953, inside the heart of the Beyoğlu district in Istanbul, a young woman named Emel walked through the heavy velvet curtains of a high-end jazz club. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the low hum of a live saxophone. She moved with a practiced grace that suggested she belonged in the spotlight. As she stepped onto the polished wooden floor of the stage, a single strand of her pearl necklace suddenly snapped and scattered across the dark boards. The white beads rolled into the shadows near the front row, but she did not stop to gather them. She simply adjusted her dress and waited for the music to begin without looking back. Emel was the rising star of the Istanbul cabaret scene, and her stage name was the Dancer of Death. She was only 24 years old, but she possessed a presence that commanded the attention of every diplomat and industrialist in the room. Her life was defined by the rigid schedules of performance and the expectations of the city elite. Every night before the first note was played, she followed a precise ritual in her dressing room. She applied a specific shade of crimson lipstick that matched the silk of her costume perfectly. She used a small silver brush to smooth her hair while staring into the heavy vanity mirror. She never allowed anyone to enter the room during this time. Once her makeup was set, she poured herself exactly 1 glass of raki and drank it 10 minutes before taking the stage. The sharp and bitter taste of the anise-flavored spirit was her final preparation for the night. She believed the drink cleared her throat and settled the nerves she still felt after years of performing for the public. Her occupation required her to navigate a world of built-in contradictions where she was both a public figure and a private mystery. She trusted the order of the club and the security of the high-ranking men who watched her from the shadows. She believed the systems of the city were designed to protect someone with her connections and talent. She was a woman of habits, and she kept a small leather notebook where she tracked her earnings with military precision. Every lira was accounted for, and she had been saving for a specific goal for over 3 years. She wanted to move to Paris and open her own small dance studio away from the smoke of the Istanbul underworld. She was already in the final month of her contract and had placed a deposit on a small apartment near the Seine. The dream was close enough that she could almost feel the cool morning air of a different city. She kept the receipt for the deposit tucked inside her vanity mirror as a reminder of the life she was building. There were small details about her that served no purpose to her career, but defined her humanity. She had a habit of tapping her fingers against her palm 3 times whenever she felt a moment of uncertainty. She also carried a small dried flower inside her locket that she had found in a garden when she was a child in the country. The club was a place of sensory extremes, where the smell of heavy tobacco smoke mixed with the aroma of roasted coffee and sweat. The sound of the ice clinking in the glasses was the only thing that could compete with the music. The audience was a sea of dark suits and white shirts that blurred together under the dim lights. Emil knew every corner of the stage and every creak in the floorboards that she had to avoid during her routine. She felt the heat of the spotlights on her skin and the weight of the silk against her legs as she moved. The world outside the club felt distant and irrelevant as long as the music was playing and the crowd was quiet. One man was a constant fixture in that world, and he sat at a small table in the far corner of the room. He was a regular guest, known only to the staff as the Shadow Man, because he never spoke to the other patrons. He arrived at the same time every evening and watched her performance with an intensity that never wavered. He never sent flowers or notes to her dressing room like the other men, but his presence was a form of security for her. She had come to rely on the sight of his cigarette, glowing in the dark, as a sign that the night was proceeding as it should. He was a piece of the furniture in her professional life. On a Tuesday evening in late autumn, the routine of the club was interrupted by a small but noticeable change. The Shadow Man did not arrive at his usual time, and his corner table remained empty for the first time in a year. Emil noticed the vacant space as soon as she walked through the curtains for her first set. She felt a momentary flicker of doubt and tapped her fingers against her palm as she waited for the saxophone to start. She quickly told herself that he had probably fallen ill or had been delayed by the heavy rain outside. She decided to ignore the absence and focused on her movement as the spotlight found her. The actual event occurred in the early hours of the morning, after the club had finally closed its doors. Emil left through the back exit and stepped into a damp alleyway that led toward the Para Palace Hotel. The air was cold and smelled of old salt from the nearby harbor and the wet stones of the city. A hand wrapped in a silk stocking suddenly reached out from the darkness and tightened around her windpipe with a lethal force. She was pulled back into the shadows before she could make a sound or reach for the heavy door. Her lungs burned for a breath of air that was being cut off by the grip of a stranger. Political instability in that era often produced a silence so dense that it absorbed the sounds of a struggle. A young woman was discarded in an alleyway, while the men who knew her name continued their dinners 3 blocks away. This was the cold reality of a city where the powerful were never questioned. She was found the next morning by a kitchen porter who was taking out the trash behind the hotel. Her body was laid out in the mud with a page from a popular fashion magazine stuffed deep into her mouth. The silk stocking used to end her life was still tied in a tight and professional knot around her neck. The local police arrived at the scene and initially treated the case with the urgency of a high-profile murder. They began by interviewing the staff at the club and tracing the movements of the diplomats who had been in the front row. They collected several names of influential figures who had been seen talking to her that night. However, the investigation began to stall as soon as the leads pointed towards certain wealthy industrial magnates. The detectives found that their detailed case files were suddenly being misplaced or lost within the station. Witnesses who had been eager to speak earlier began to retract their statements or claim they saw nothing. The press was eventually ordered by the government to stop reporting on the murder to preserve public morality and order. The story of the Dancer of Death was scrubbed from the front pages and moved to the back of the papers. The investigation was shifted away from the elite and toward the idea of a random predator. Emil had made a decision to leave the club alone that night, despite the warnings she had received from the management. She believed her own status would protect her, and she chose to walk the short distance to the hotel without a guard. That rational decision within her own logic pushed her directly into the path of the killer. The reconstruction of the crime scene revealed that her expensive jewelry and her leather purse were left completely untouched. This detail immediately ruled out the theory of a random mugging that the police were trying to promote. The motive was clearly personal or intended to send a specific message to the city. A forensic examination of the magazine page found in her throat revealed it was from a luxury edition only available to the elite. This particular publication was imported from France and was sold at only 2 locations in all of Istanbul. The paper was high quality and had not been damaged by the rain that fell that night. Each new piece of information only made the central question larger as the police realized they were dealing with a professional. The lack of any struggle and the precise nature of the knot suggested a killer with high status and low impulse control. The silence from the authorities confirmed that the perpetrator was protected. The detectives found a receipt for a deposit on an apartment in Paris, tucked inside her vanity mirror at the club. This small scrap of paper represented a future that would never happen and a dream that was cut short in an alley. It was the most painful part of the file for the officers who still cared about the truth. One detective continued to look for the shadow man who had vanished on the same night as the murder. He believed the regular guest was the key to understanding the final hours of the dancer. He searched the boarding houses near the harbor, but found no trace of the man or his cigarettes in the city. The twist was uncovered when a small notebook was found hidden under the floorboards of the dressing room. It contained a warning written in a hurried hand that told Emil to stay away from the front row guests. The shadow man was not a stalker, but a protector who had been watching her from the corner for a year. He had disappeared because he was the only one who saw the face of the man who followed her into the alley. He knew that the killer was the same person who funded the police station and controlled the press. The danger was not a stranger in the shadows, but the very person who sat in the light. You are Emil right now. The air in the alley is damp and smells of old salt and expensive tobacco. A hand wrapped in silk is tightening around your windpipe, and you can see the lights of the hotel just out of reach. Your lungs are burning for a breath that will not come as the world begins to turn gray. Do you try to claw at the face you recognize from the front row of the club? Or do you spend your final seconds trying to pull the magazine page out of your mouth so you can scream? The choice must be made in the heartbeat before the darkness takes over and the pressure of the silk becomes absolute. The case was officially archived as a random mugging, despite the evidence found by the detectives on the scene. No one was ever named as the killer, and the files were eventually moved to a dusty room in the police museum. The name of the dancer of death faded from the public memory within a single year. The crimson lipstick and the silver brush remained in her dressing room until they were eventually thrown away by the next performer. The dream of a dance studio in Paris died in that alley, along with the woman who worked for it. The city continued to move, as if nothing had happened behind the velvet curtains. In a city of shadows, the truth is often the first thing to be discarded to keep the machinery of the elite running. The underworld and the political class are often indistinguishable when the lights are turned off and the music stops. The dead do not get to tell the story of the hands that reached for them. In July of 1957, in the factory town of Martfu, Hungary, a woman named Magdalena Janos walked alone along the banks of the Tisza River. She was moving quickly toward her home after a long shift at the shoe factory, following a narrow path through the tall reeds that rustled in the breeze. However, as she reached a bend in the river, she stopped and looked down at a single muddy boot print that was pointing away from the town and toward the dark woods. 7 kilometers away, a man named Peter Kovacs sat in the cab of his state-owned truck and finished his paperwork for the day. He was a driver who had worked for the transport company for over 12 years without receiving a single reprimand from his supervisors. He was known as a man who valued order and punctuality above all else in both his professional life and his personal work. Every evening, he spent 10 minutes polishing the chrome of his dashboard with a soft yellow cloth until it shone like glass. He believed that the condition of a man's vehicle was a direct reflection of his reliability as a citizen of the Republic. He was often cited by his supervisors as a model worker for the younger drivers to emulate within the company. Peter was also a husband and a father who spent his weekends helping his neighbors with minor household repairs. He had a reputation for being a trusted figure who never spoke out of turn and always followed the rules of the local community. People in Martfu considered him a pillar of the steady and predictable life of a factory town worker. He had a small habit that served no purpose to his job or his family life, but was a constant part of his daily routine. Every morning he would pick up a smooth gray pebble from his driveway and carry it in his left pocket until he returned home. He never looked at the stones or saved them, but he felt a strange discomfort if his pocket was empty during his shift. He was currently in the third month of a self-taught course in mechanical drafting, and he kept his blueprints rolled up in the back of his truck. He planned to apply for a promotion to the design department once he finished the final module of the program. He spent his lunch breaks drawing precise lines and angles on graph paper while he ate his meal. The interior of his truck smelled of diesel fuel and the cheap peppermint lozenges he chewed to keep himself alert during long hauls. The sound of the engine idling was a steady and comforting rhythm that anchored him to the physical world of metal and oil. He felt a deep sense of security within the systems that governed his daily life. The town of Martfu was a collection of gray concrete buildings and cobblestone streets that had been built to house the thousands of laborers for the factory. At night, the only light came from the dim lamps at the corners and the glow of the furnace chimneys in the distance. It was an environment where every person was expected to have a clear destination. Peter enjoyed the way the heavy truck tires sounded as they rolled over the wet stones of the main thoroughfare. He knew every turn and every alleyway in the town because he had traversed them thousands of times in the service of the state. He saw himself as an essential gear in a machine that was designed to never stop moving for any reason. A few weeks after the boot print was seen by the river, the town was shaken by the news of a brutal discovery in the reeds. The local police acted with immediate and intense pressure to find a culprit to present to the state authorities. They quickly focused all their attention on a man named Akos Kyrili, who had once been a lover of the victim. Akos was a simple man who worked at the factory and had no history of violence or trouble with the law. He initially assumed the officers were just asking for his help in the investigation, and he answered every question with honesty. He told them he had been at home sleeping on the night of the incident and had no witnesses to prove his claim. The detectives noted that Akos seemed nervous during the interrogation, and they used this as evidence of his underlying guilt. They told him that the state required a confession to close the case, and that things would go better for him if he cooperated. Akos continued to insist on his innocence, while the pressure in the room began to mount. The police eventually used a combination of sleep deprivation and physical coercion to extract a signed confession from Akos Kyrili. He was sentenced to life in prison, and the case was officially declared solved by the regional prosecutor's office. The town returned to its quiet routine, believing that the danger had been permanently removed from the riverbank. However, the murders did not stop with the incarceration of the man the state had branded as a monster. Over the next several years, more women were found murdered in the same sadistic manner along the banks of the river and in the dark alleys. Each event was more brutal than the last, and the details were identical to the first crime. Socialist doctrine maintained that serial homicide was a symptom of capitalist decay and therefore non-existent in a communist utopia like Hungary. The government refused to admit they had the wrong man in prison because doing so would admit a failure of the system. They simply ignored the pattern of deaths and treated each one as an isolated event. Peter Kovacs continued to drive his truck through the town and observe the police patrols as they moved through the streets. He maintained his perfect record and his polished dashboard while the body count continued to rise in the shadows. He watched the news of the subsequent trials with a quiet and detached curiosity from his living room. He felt a cold and jagged spike of satisfaction as he realized the system was working exactly as he had hoped it would. The authorities were so committed to their own perfection that they were willing to provide him with a shield. He felt invisible and untouchable within the gears of a state that refused to acknowledge his existence. The character of the town began to shift as the realization of an active predator became impossible to ignore for the residents. People no longer walked alone after dark, and the silence of the night was filled with a new kind of tension. Logic failed to explain why the killings continued, while while the supposed murderer sat in a high-security cell. The residents shifted to instinctual behavior, as they realized they could not rely on the state to provide them with protection or truth. Decisions were no longer based on the old rules of the community, but on the immediate need for physical safety. The shadow of the riverbank became a place of terror that no one dared to visit after the sun went down. Between each new discovery of a body, there was a brief breath where things appeared to stabilize before they continued to deteriorate. The authorities would release a statement claiming that the situation was under control and that no further danger existed. But the sound of the river always reminded the people that something was still waiting in the tall reeds. In 1967, 10 years after the first murder, Peter Kovacs was finally caught red-handed after an attempted assault on a local woman. The investigation into his life revealed a history of necrophilic behavior that he had hidden behind his role as a model worker. The police found evidence of his crimes hidden inside the very truck he used for his job. Reconstruction from the fragments of his life showed that he had been scouting for vulnerable women during his delivery routes for a decade. He used the predictable schedules of the factory workers to plan his attacks with the same precision he used for his drafting. Each piece of testimony from his neighbors painted a picture of a man who was invisible. The police found a heavy and metallic tire iron hidden under the driver's seat of the truck, still bearing the microscopic traces of the victims. Peter had cleaned it after every use with the same yellow cloth he used to polish his dashboard. The tool of his occupation had become the primary instrument of his violence against the people of the town. The Hungarian state spent over 2 million forints to maintain the surveillance and imprisonment of a man they knew was innocent while a predator continued to hunt. Ideological preservation is a luxury that requires a constant payment in human lives to keep the machinery of the Republic appearing perfect to the rest of the world. The most disturbing part of the investigation was the discovery that Peter had attended the trial of Akos Kirli in 1957. He sat in the gallery and watched as the innocent man was sentenced to a life of hard labor for a crime he had committed himself. Peter described the experience to the detectives as a form of high-quality entertainment. The investigators realized that the central question of the case was no longer about the identity of the killer, but about the failure of the institution. Each new piece of evidence they gathered from the truck only made the silence of the past 10 years look more like a crime. They were holding the proof of a decade of state-sanctioned negligence. The twist in the case did not just surprise the public, but reinterpreted the meaning of every government statement made since the first murder. The tool meant to ensure survival and order, the legal system of the Republic, was actually the primary cause of the ongoing tragedy. The state had acted as the shield that allowed the predator to thrive. The path home by the river is slick with mud, and the sound of the Tisza is a steady and low roar that drowns out the world. A heavy footstep sounds behind the trees, rhythmic and patient, as a shadow stretches long under the flickering light. The boots feel heavy, and the lungs are burning for air. Does the survivor turn around to face the stranger, or do they start to run? Peter Kovacs was led into the courtroom where he stood with the same calm and detached expression he had worn behind the wheel of his truck. He admitted to the murders of 4 women with a voice that was cold and entirely devoid of remorse or emotion. He looked at the gallery as if he were simply reporting a successful delivery of goods to a client. The judge sentenced Peter Kovacs to death by hanging, a decision that was carried out in 1968. The state finally admitted that he was the sole perpetrator of the crimes that had plagued the riverbank for a decade. The proceedings were kept brief, and the public was not allowed to hear the full details of the investigation into the local police. Akos Kirli was released from prison after spending 10 years in a labor camp for crimes he had never even seen. He was given no compensation and no apology from the government that had stolen a decade of his life to maintain a lie. He walked out of the prison gates with nothing but the clothes he had been wearing when he was first arrested. The factory in Martfu continued to operate, and the river continued to flow past the reeds where the boot prints had once been found. The apartment where Akos lived was empty, and his belongings had long ago been discarded by the state. The mundane objects of a destroyed life are often the only things that remain after the system is finished with them. The truth is a luxury that few can afford when the price is the survival of a powerful ideology. We often believe that the structures of our society are built to protect us from the monsters in the dark. But sometimes the structures are the very things that make the darkness possible for those who know how to hide inside the gears of the state. The muddy banks of the Tisza River eventually went quiet, leaving behind only the memory of a man who was punished for another's sins. But as we move from the industrial plains of Hungary into the streets of Tel Aviv, we find a different kind of fear. It was not the terror of a hidden monster, but the calculation of a political assassination. We move from the industrial plains of Hungary into the flickering street lamps of Israel, where a blood-stained briefcase would tell a different story. In that city, the safety of a home provided no protection against a conspiracy that had been growing for years. The air of the Mediterranean coast would soon carry the sound of 3 shots in the dark. One March evening in 1957, in the coastal city of Tel Aviv, a man named Rudolf Kastner pulled his car to a stop in front of his apartment building. He had just finished a long day at the editorial offices of his newspaper, and the air was thick with the scent of salt from the Mediterranean. He gathered his leather briefcase and prepared to step out. The street was lined with modest residential buildings and the typical quiet of a middle-class neighborhood after dark. Rudolf checked his mirror and saw the usual shadows of the trees swaying in the light breeze. He opened his door and stepped onto the pavement, his shoes making a crisp sound against the asphalt. He felt the familiar weight of his keys. However, just as he reached the edge of the sidewalk, a single street lamp directly over his front door flickered twice and then went completely dark. This sudden loss of light left the entrance to his building in a deep and unnatural pool of shadow. Rudolf paused for a second with his hand on the door handle, looking into the blackness of the hallway. Rudolf Kastner was a high-ranking official in the Israeli government who had spent his life navigating the complexities of survival and politics. He was a man who understood the value of systems and the weight of official titles in a young nation. He believed that his position provided a layer of protection that was recognized by everyone in the city. He was a man of very specific habits and numbers that defined the rhythm of his daily life. He had personally overseen the rescue of exactly 1,684 people during the war, a feat he carried as both a badge and a burden. He smoked the same brand of cheap tobacco every hour on the hour since he was 20 years old. Rudolf was currently in the 3rd year of a grueling legal battle that had stripped away much of his public dignity. He carried a heavy leather briefcase that was filled with thousands of pages of court transcripts and personal testimonies from his trial. He spent his evenings reviewing every line of the cross-examinations to find a path toward his exoneration. There were small details about him that served no function in his professional life, but were noticed by those closest to him. He had a habit of adjusting his glasses 3 times whenever he began to read a difficult passage of text. He also kept a single unmailed letter in his pocket that he had written to a friend who had disappeared long ago. The air inside the courtroom, where his life was being picked apart, always smelled of old paper and stale tobacco smoke. He felt the weight of the gaze of the spectators who looked at him with a mixture of awe and absolute contempt. The sound of the judge's gavel was the only thing that could cut through the thick tension of the room. Rudolf was intimately familiar with the way a person's soul can be dissected by the law and the public. He had watched as his own reputation was transformed from that of a hero into that of a collaborator in the eyes of his fellow citizens. He felt the isolation of a man who had made impossible choices in a time of genocide. He took a certain comfort in the predictability of his evening walk from his car to the safety of his apartment. He knew the sounds of the neighborhood and the faces of the people who lived on his floor. He saw himself as a man who had already survived the worst the world could offer and had come out the other side intact. Each sensory detail of his surroundings was a testament to the stability he had worked so hard to find in Israel. The smell of the sea and the distant sound of a radio playing a folk song were the background of his reality. He could not hear the footsteps of the men waiting for him in the darkness of the doorway. A few nights before the incident, Rudolf noticed a car with darkened windows parked near his apartment for 3 nights in a row. He saw the faint glow of a cigarette inside the vehicle, but could not make out the faces of the occupants. He told himself it was likely just neighbors, or perhaps a patrol from the local station. He chose to ignore the prickling sensation on the back of his neck as he walked past the vehicle. He convinced himself that as a government official, he was being watched for his own protection rather than for any malicious reason. He made the active decision to keep his routine exactly as it had been for the last 5 years. The actual event occurred as Rudolph turned his key in the lock of the main entrance to his building. 3 young men emerged from the deep shadows of the hallway with the speed of trained operatives. There was no conversation and no demand for his money or the briefcase he held tightly in his right hand as he stood there. 3 shots were fired at point-blank range, the muzzle flashes illuminating the cramped space of the foyer for a fraction of a second. The sound of the reports was muffled by the stone walls of the building, but felt like physical blows to the chest. Rudolph collapsed onto the cold tile floor while the briefcase slid across the room. A man's survival during a genocide is sometimes treated as a confession of guilt by those who did not have to make his choices. Rudolf Kastner was executed by his own people for the sin of staying alive while others were lost in the darkness of Europe. The internal logic of a nation in pain required a target for its anger. The gunman fled the scene immediately, leaving Rudolph bleeding on the floor near his front door. He tried to reach for his glasses, which had fallen a few feet away, but his limbs were beginning to feel heavy and unresponsive. He could hear the sound of doors opening upstairs and the frantic voices of his neighbors calling for help. The local police and the Secret Service arrived within minutes and cordoned off the entire block with heavy tape. They acted with a level of coordination that suggested they were already prepared for an emergency in this specific location. They began to collect evidence and interview the witnesses who had seen the men running toward a car. The 3 shooters were caught within a few days and identified as members of a right-wing militant group. They did not deny their involvement in the shooting and claimed they were acting out of a sense of national duty. However, the lead investigator found that one of the men had strange ties to the state security services. Reconstruction of the surveillance logs from the night of the assassination revealed a disturbing pattern of behavior by the authorities. It appeared that the apartment building had been under active observation by the Shin Bet for several days. Yet, the agents on the scene did not intervene when the 3 gunmen moved toward the target. The case files began to show that the gunmen might have been allowed to act or even encouraged by elements within the government. The motive was to silence a man whose trial was tearing the social fabric of the young country apart. Each new piece of testimony only made the conspiracy look more like a state-sanctioned event. Rudolph had initially clung to the old frame of reference that his service to the nation would eventually be recognized as honorable. He applied the logic of the law even as the public sentiment turned against him with increasing violence. He believed that the facts of his rescue mission would speak louder than the accusations of his enemies. As the shots landed, his logic failed him, and his body took over the struggle for survival. His decisions were no longer based on the outcome of his trial, but on the immediate need for a single breath of air. He realized in those final moments that he had misread the nature of his own safety within the borders of his home. The character of the city changed as the news of the assassination spread through the cafes and the government offices. People who had called for his death were suddenly silent as the reality of a political murder settled over them. The smell of the sea was replaced by the cold scent of hospital disinfectant and the fear of a civil war. Between the shooting and the final report, there was a brief breath where the situation appeared to stabilize. The doctors announced that Rudolph was in stable condition and might survive the injuries to his torso. But the underlying pressure of the political scandal continued to grow until the stability was revealed as an illusion. The goal of the investigation was not to answer the questions about the shooters, but to make the questions about their handlers grow larger. Each new piece of information about the Shin Bet's presence in the neighborhood opened a new hole in the official story. The narrative of the state began to resemble a report from a war zone. You are Rudolph Kastner right now. The street is quiet, and the air is smelling of sea salt and diesel exhaust from a passing bus. You see 3 figures stepping out of the shadows near your doorstep, their hands hidden in their coat pockets. You feel the weight of your briefcase in your hand, filled with the papers of a life being picked apart. You are a man who spent his life making impossible deals to save thousands from the fire. You have stood before high-ranking monsters and bargained for souls with nothing but your own words. Now you are standing in the dark of your own hallway, looking into the eyes of young men who see you as a traitor to be erased. Do you call out to them, expecting the respect your title usually commands from the citizens of your country? Or do you turn back toward the light of the main road, realizing the silence of the street is intentional? You must choose in the second before the first muzzle flash blinds you and the briefcase hits the ground forever. The twist in the case was the revelation that one of the shooters, Zayev Eckstein, had been a paid informant for the security services. He believed that he was performing a mission that had been approved by the very people Rudolph served. The tool meant to ensure the survival of the state was actually the cause of the murder. Heard from the beginning, the listener now sees that all the signs were already there in the flickering light and the darkened car. The state did not need to pull the trigger themselves if they could simply allow the anger of the public to finish the job. Rudolf Kastner was a man who became a liability that the nation could not carry. Rudolf Kastner died of his wounds 11 days after the shooting, leaving behind a legacy that remains one of the most painful in history. The government issued a brief statement confirming his passing, but offered no official sympathy or acknowledgement of his service. The file on the Shin Bet's involvement was eventually placed in a vault. His blood-stained briefcase was returned to his family, its leather still smelling of the tobacco he had smoked for 30 years. The thousands of pages inside were never used to exonerate him in a court of law while he was still alive. These ordinary papers are the only physical evidence of a man who tried to negotiate with the abyss. The truth is often a burden that a young nation is not yet strong enough to carry without breaking apart. We believe that our homes are the one place where the rules of the world cannot reach us or our families. But sometimes the shadows in our own hallways are the very places where the debts of the past are finally collected. The streets of Tel Aviv eventually returned to their quiet routine, leaving behind only the memory of 3 shots in the dark. But while one man's trial ended in the silence of a hospital, another killer's journey was just beginning in the elite circles of Poland. There, the danger was not a political hit, but a friend with a silver tea set. We move from the coastal winds of Israel into the polished apartments of Krakow, where hospitality was used as a mask for murder. In that city, the scent of cyanide was hidden behind the aroma of expensive coffee served on lace tablecloths. There, the most dangerous person in the room was the one who had invited you to dinner. The Gentleman of Krakow believed his charm was a physical barrier that the law could never hope to breach. He sat across from his guests and watched them drink from his silver cups, while the evidence of his crimes was curing under the floor. We move from the shadows of the Mediterranean into the cold elegance of a killer's parlor. In 1955, in the historic city of Krakow, Poland, a man named Władysław Brilski sat inside a pristine apartment. The room was decorated with heavy oak furniture and fine art that spoke of old wealth and social stability. Władysław was enjoying a late afternoon tea with his close friend in a setting that felt entirely safe and sophisticated for both men. The host moved with a practiced elegance as he poured the hot liquid into delicate porcelain cups. He offered a small plate of expensive biscuits and spoke about the latest business trends in the city. However, Władysław noticed a single off detail that did not fit the hospitable scene. His host poured the tea for both of them, but did not take a single sip of his own cup. The host was Władysław Mazurkiewicz, the most respected socialite in the post-war elite circles of Krakow. He was a man who navigated high society with an ease that suggested he had never known a day of struggle in his life. He was often seen at the best restaurants and the most exclusive clubs, always surrounded by the city's most influential and powerful figures. People in the city trusted him implicitly because he represented the kind of order and charm that many felt had been lost during the war. He was a successful businessman who always seemed to have a new and lucrative opportunity to share with his inner circle. His reputation was a physical barrier that protected him from any suspicion or local gossip from the police. Mazurkiewicz was a man who defined himself through the precision of his appearance and his daily routines. He wore only tailored suits made from the finest wool, and he spent exactly 40 minutes every morning polishing his leather shoes. He carried a distinct scent of expensive French cologne that announced his arrival long before he actually entered a room. He had a habit of adjusting his cufflinks exactly twice whenever he was about to conclude a business transaction. He He had brokered exactly 47 successful property deals in the last 5 years alone, making him a very wealthy man. He was currently in the middle of a complex negotiation for a new warehouse space that would potentially double his monthly income. Mazurkiewicz spent his afternoons at the same corner cafe, ordering a single espresso and reading the business section of the newspaper. He would spend exactly 20 minutes engaged in this routine before walking to the bank to check his accounts. He was a man of precision who never left anything to chance when it came to his public image in the city. There were small details about him that seemed to have no plot function, but made him feel incredibly real to his associates. He always carried a silver pocket watch that had been stopped at 12 o'clock for over a decade. He also had a tendency to hum a specific nursery rhyme under his breath when he was deep in thought at his desk or during a long dinner party. He never explained why the watch was broken or why he chose that particular melody to repeat during the day. These meaningless quirks were treated as the eccentricities of a man who was too successful to be questioned by his peers. When he finally disappeared from the social scene, these small things would become the most painful memories for all of his friends. The apartment was a sanctuary of sensory perfection where the world outside the heavy doors ceased to exist. The smell of rich coffee beans and the faint aroma of leather-bound books created an atmosphere of absolute comfort. Every sensory detail in that space was designed to place the visitor inside a feeling of total and permanent security for the entire afternoon. The sound of the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway provided a steady and calming rhythm for the conversation. The host ensured that every guest felt like they were the most important person in Krakow for the duration of their visit. The audience could not name what felt wrong, but they could never quite shake a sense of growing unease as the sun began to set. As Władysław Brilski lifted his cup to his lips, he noticed a very small and subtle warning sign. There was a faint and bitter almond scent rising from the steam of the tea that he had never encountered before. He paused for a fraction of a second, his mind trying to reconcile the smell with the high-quality blend he was drinking in his friend's quiet home. He looked across the table and saw his host smiling at him with a gaze that was steady and entirely unblinking. Władysław quickly dismissed the thought as a trick of the light, or perhaps a new type of herbal infusion from the local market. He decided to trust his friend and took a long and deep swallow of the warm liquid in his hand as the host watched him. The point of no return arrived only seconds later as the first wave of a massive and inexplicable pain hit his stomach. Władysław tried to stand up, but his legs felt as if they had been turned into heavy lead, and he collapsed. The world began to spin in a violent blur of oak furniture and silver tea sets as he hit the floor while his host remained seated. There was no scream and no call for help as his throat began to tighten and his vision started to fade into black. He could see the shoes of his host, standing perfectly still, just a few inches from his face on the polished boards. Władysław realized in that moment that the nature of his friendship had been misread from the very beginning of the afternoon. Despite the lethal dose of cyanide in his system, Władysław Brilski did not die in the parlor that day. He managed to crawl out of the apartment and down the stairs, using only the raw instinct of his body to keep moving. He reached the street and was found by a passing motorist who rushed him to the nearest hospital where the doctors were already waiting. The doctors were horrified to discover the presence of poison in a man who had been out for a casual afternoon tea. Władysław was able to whisper the name of the most respected socialite in Krakow before he drifted into a deep coma. The report was sent to the police station, where the officers initially refused to believe the claim against their favorite citizen. The character of the investigation shifted as the authorities realized they could not ignore the statement of a dying man. They went to the apartment of Mazurkiewicz and found him sitting calmly at his desk as if nothing had happened. He greeted the officers with his usual charm and offered them a seat in the very room where the attack had occurred. The first hypothesis was that Brilski had suffered a sudden medical emergency and had confused his friend in his delirium. This was a simple and reasonable explanation that the social elite of Krakow were eager to accept as the truth. However, the lead detective noticed that the garage floor had been recently covered with a thick layer of fresh gray concrete. Mazurkiewicz operated for over a decade in Krakow and used his connections to the secret police to deflect 6 different official inquiries into his missing associates. His confidence was a physical barrier that allowed him to host the very investigators searching for the bodies buried under his feet. Stopped completely. The police began a careful reconstruction of the building, using fragments of testimony and physical evidence from the hidden corners. Each new piece of information simultaneously answered an old question and opened a new and much larger one. They realized that several of the host's previous business associates had also vanished without any explanation or trace. The voice of the investigation grew colder and more precise as the floor of the garage was systematically broken apart. They found the remains of a man who had disappeared 3 years earlier, his body encased in the heavy stone. As they continued to dig, they found 5 more bodies buried in the same calculated and professional manner under the apartment. The detectives discovered that Mazurkiewicz had been poisoning his friends and business partners to steal their properties and their life savings. He used his connections to the secret police to ensure that no one ever looked too closely at his sudden wealth. He was a narcissist who had been hiding in the plain sight of the city's highest social circles for years. The investigation also uncovered several letters written by the victims before they disappeared. These letters spoke of their total trust in Mazurkiewicz and their excitement about the new investments he had proposed to them. Reading these words after finding the bodies in the garage was a harrowing experience for the detectives working on the case. The forensic team spent weeks sifting through the debris under the apartment, looking for any personal effects that might identify the dead. They found a single gold ring and a set of keys that belonged to a merchant who had been missing for 5 years. Each discovery added a new layer of tragedy to the polished and elegant life of the gentleman killer. The twist in the case did not just surprise the city, but reinterpreted the meaning of every dinner party and business deal he had conducted. The tool meant to ensure survival and trust, the silver tea set of hospitality, was actually the primary cause of the tragedy. Every guest who had ever sat at that table had been a potential victim in his eyes the whole time. You are Vladislav Brilski. The coffee is rich and hot, but there is a strange and bitter bitterness on the back of your tongue that you cannot place. You see your friend Vladislav smiling at you across the silver tea set, and his eyes are steady. Your limbs are beginning to feel heavy, as if the blood in your veins has turned to lead. Do you reach for the water glass, or do you try to run? The most chilling realization was that Mazurkiewicz had once invited a senior police officer to dinner while a body was still fresh in the next room. He had sat there and discussed the rising crime rate in Krakow while his victim lay silent behind a thin wooden door. His confidence in his own charm was so absolute that he felt no fear of being caught by the law. Władysław Mazurkiewicz was found guilty of 6 counts of murder and was sentenced to death by the High Court of Poland. He was executed in 1957, maintaining his elegant and detached demeanor until the very end of his life. He went to the gallows with the same polished shoes he had worn to his elite dinner parties and social gatherings in the city. The court proceedings were attended by the survivors and the families of those who had vanished into the concrete. They listened in silence as the details of the poisonings were read aloud in a cold and factual tone. There was no apology from the man in the dock, only a slight nod of acknowledgement as each piece of evidence was presented to the judge. His pristine apartment was eventually emptied of its oak furniture, and the silver tea set was sold at a public auction to a stranger. The garage floor was repaired, but the memory of what was found beneath it never faded from the neighborhood residents. Ordinary objects like a porcelain cup and a lace tablecloth were where the real horror of his crimes lived. The charm of a monster is often the only thing that protects them from the truth of their own actions. We believe that we can recognize a predator by the way they look or the way they speak in the shadows. But sometimes the person standing closest to the light is the one who has the most to hide from the rest of the world. It is a truth we all share in the dark. The elegant parlor of Krakow went silent, leaving behind only the scent of bitter almonds and the memory of a silver tea set. But as we move from the cold apartments of Poland into the stone halls of Jerusalem, we find a different kind of violence. It was not the poison of a friend, but the bullets of a political conspiracy in a sacred and holy place. We leave the sophisticated circles of the Polish elite and enter the echoing silence of the Al-Aqsa Mosque in 1951. There, the ground was not used to conceal victims, but was itself the site of a public execution of royalty. The gold-trimmed robes of a king would soon be stained with a crimson that no social status could ever wash away or hide. In July of 1951, in the rolling hills of southern Moravia, the village of Babice sat under a heavy summer sun. The air was thick with the scent of ripening grain and the distant sound of a tractor working the nearby fields. It was a place where everyone knew the rhythm of the harvest and the tolling of the local church bell. But inside the small village schoolhouse, the atmosphere had suddenly shifted into something else. A single chalkboard was covered in unfinished grammar lessons, the white dust still fresh on the wooden tray. On the floor beneath a heavy oak desk lay a pair of teacher's spectacles, the glass shattered into a dozen jagged pieces. There was no one in the room to explain why the books were left open or why the chairs had been tossed aside. A heavy iron silence had settled over the building that should have been full of life. Jan Bula was a 31-year-old priest who had served the community for 3 years with a quiet and steady devotion. He was the kind of man who preferred the company of his rose bushes to the complex arguments of the city politicians. Every morning at precisely 6 o'clock, he could be found in the church garden with a small watering can. He moved with a slow and deliberate pace that suggested he had all the time in the world. The villagers often saw him sitting on a stone bench in the late afternoon, reading poetry to the elderly who could no longer see the page. He had finished exactly 12 books for the residents of the local infirmary in the last 6 months alone. He kept a meticulous record of these readings in a small leather diary he carried in his vest. To him, these small acts of service were the primary foundation of a meaningful and holy life. He was in the middle of planning a new roof for the parish house and had spent weeks sketching the wooden rafters in his notebook. He had saved every spare koruna for 2 years to ensure the materials were of the highest quality for the project. Jan also had a tendency to hum a specific folk melody whenever he was weeding the flower beds. It was a tune from his childhood that he never shared with anyone, keeping it as an anchor. The parish house smelled of beeswax, dried lavender, and the faint, sweet aroma of old incense that clung to the walls. Inside his study, the light filtered through the stained glass, casting patterns of blue and red across the dusty floorboards. The sound of the wind through the lime trees was the only thing that interrupted his prayers during the long nights. He felt a deep sense of security within the stone walls of his small world. One evening in June, a man named Ladislav Mali arrived at the parish door, claiming to be a leader of a secret resistance cell. He wore a dirty coat and spoke in hushed, urgent tones about a coming revolution against the state authorities. Jan listened to the man with a growing sense of unease, noting the way the stranger's eyes darted toward the window. He eventually decided the man was likely just a frightened drifter, looking for a meal. The stranger returned 2 nights later, this time asking for a place to hide a cache of weapons for the movement. Jan refused the request immediately, stating that his church was a place of peace and not a warehouse for the instruments of war. He watched from the porch as the man disappeared into the shadows of the woods. He told himself that he had made the right choice and that the incident was now behind him for good. He spent the next week focused on his garden, trying to put the image of the desperate man out of his mind. He pruned the roses and checked the progress of the lilies that were beginning to bloom near the altar. He found comfort in the predictable growth of the plants and the steady warmth of the July sun. He believed that if he remained faithful to his duties, the turmoil of the outside world would simply pass him by. The incident occurred on the night of July 2nd, when a group of armed men forced their way into the village schoolhouse. 3 local Communist Party officials were meeting in the small office to discuss the summer grain quotas. Without a word of warning or a demand for surrender, the men opened fire with automatic weapons. The sound of the reports shattered the quiet of the night and left the wooden walls riddled with bullet holes. The 3 officials were killed instantly, their bodies slumping over the very desks where they had been reviewing the quotas. The gunmen disappeared into the woods as quickly as they had arrived, leaving behind only the smell of burnt cordite. The state authorities arrived at the scene within the hour and immediately declared the attack an act of Western terrorism. They pointed the finger directly at the local Catholic Church. Jan Bula was arrested the following morning while he was tending to his roses in the garden behind the parish house. The officers did not present a warrant or explain the charges as they dragged him toward a waiting black sedan. He remained calm, believing that a simple conversation with the investigators would clear up the misunderstanding. He trusted that the truth was a physical force that would eventually reveal itself. He was taken to a high-security prison where the stone walls were damp and the only light came from a single bulb in the hallway. He spent the next 3 days in total isolation, waiting for someone to ask him about his movements on the night of the shooting. His logic was still based on the old rules of a just society where evidence and testimony mattered. He did not yet realize that the outcome of his trial had been decided long ago. As the interrogations began, his logic failed, and his decisions were no longer thought-based, but were driven by survival instinct. He realized that the questions being asked were not meant to gather information, but were designed to force a confession. The investigators spoke about a conspiracy that involved hundreds of people across the entire region. Jan shifted from trying to explain the truth to simply trying to endure the weight of the pressure. He began to notice that the details the police provided about the shooting were incredibly specific for a group that claimed to be searching for answers. They knew the exact caliber of the weapons and the position of the bodies before the forensic reports were even completed. Jan realized that he was being fitted into a story that had already been written by the state. He felt the walls of the cell closing in on him as the days passed. In a state-sponsored purge, the evidence is manufactured to fit the sentence rather than the crime. 11 lives were ended to prove a conspiracy that the executioners had written themselves. Stopped completely. The initial hypothesis presented to the public was that the priests had orchestrated the massacre to destabilize the local government. This was a simple and effective narrative that the state used to justify a massive crackdown on the entire Catholic Church. However, modern historians have since reconstructed the events from the fragments of the secret police archives. They found that Ladislav Mali was not a resistance leader. The secret police files revealed that Mali was an agent provocateur who had been hired to create a reason for the political cleansing. Every new piece of information from the archives simultaneously answered an old question and opened a new and much darker one. The state had allowed the shooting of its own members to ensure the success of its propaganda campaign. The voice of the files is a cold report of a massacre designed by the state. The reconstruction showed that the guns used in the schoolhouse had been issued by the Regional Security Office just 2 days before the attack. The timeline of the gunmen's movements was perfectly coordinated with the arrival of the state film crews who were ready to capture the aftermath. Each piece of evidence made the central question of the conspiracy larger. The investigation had nothing to do with finding the real killers. You are Father Jan Bula. The courtroom is a wall of faces, and the air is heavy with the smell of wet wool and the scratch of pens on paper. You see the judge looking at you with a gaze that contains no questions, only a predetermined end. You feel the cold sweat on the back of your neck as you realize the microphones are only capturing the words they want to hear. Do you continue to testify to your innocence, or do you look toward the exit? The twist in the case did not just surprise the families of the victims, but reinterpreted the meaning of every official document. The tool meant to ensure the safety of the citizens, the state security apparatus, was actually the architect of the tragedy. The listeners now see that all the signs were already there in the way Mali appeared at the door. The priests were not the targets of a random drifter, but were the targets of a lethal trap. The show trial was held in a massive hall, where the microphones were tuned to catch every word of the forced confessions. Jan Bula stood before the judge and admitted to a conspiracy he had never been a part of in his entire life. He looked at the cameras with eyes that were hollow and devoid of the hope he once carried in his garden. The judge read the sentence of death as if he were reading a routine weather report for the morning news. Jan Bula was executed by the state in May of 1952 after spending months in the darkness of the prison. He was 31 years old and left behind nothing but his sketches of a roof that would never be built. The government issued a brief statement confirming the sentence had been carried out for the crimes against the people. His diary and his watering can were taken by the police and were eventually discarded. In the aftermath of the massacre, 11 people were executed and hundreds were sent to the uranium mines of the north. The village of Babice became a silent place where the neighbors no longer spoke to one another in the streets. The chalk remained on the board in the schoolhouse for years as a reminder of the night the logic of the village was broken. That ordinariness is where the real horror of the state violence continues to live. The truth is often a weapon that is wielded by those who have the power to define what is real and what is a lie. We believe that we can distinguish the hand of an enemy from the hand of a friend by the way they look in the light. But sometimes the people who promise to protect us are the ones who have already dug the graves. The silence of the Moravian hills is a testament to the fact that the state can be a dangerous predator. The schoolhouse in Babice went dark, leaving behind only the smell of wet wool and the memory of a shattered pair of glasses. But as we move from the rural hills of Czechoslovakia into the busy streets of Bucharest, we find another kind of state theater. There, the ground was not used to bury victims in secret, but was used as a movie set for a bizarre reenactment. We move from the silence of a village into the blinding heat of a studio light. In July of 1959, Alexandru Ionid stood in the center of the National Bank of Romania in Bucharest. The marble floors were polished to a mirror finish, and the tellers were busy counting stacks of lei behind the heavy brass bars. Everything about the morning seemed to follow the precise and predictable rhythm of a state-run institution. It was a Tuesday, and the air outside was already beginning to shimmer with the midsummer heat. Alexandru adjusted the grip on the heavy black pistol in his hand and looked toward the main entrance. He saw a group of men standing by a large tripod and a black camera box that looked entirely out of place in a financial building. The bank employees did not panic or reach for the silent alarms as he pointed the weapon at the ceiling. They simply stood perfectly still and waited for the director to call for the next take. Alexandru was a man who had spent his entire adult life serving the Communist Party with a devotion that few could match. He was a high-ranking official and a former hero of the anti-fascist resistance during the dark years of the war. He had spent exactly 15 years operating in the secret underground movements of the city. He trusted the party structures because he had helped build them from the ground up during the liberation. His occupation required him to believe in the absolute infallibility of the state and its leadership in every matter of governance. He had brokered dozens of high-level agreements between the Ministry of Interior and the local security forces. Alexandru saw himself as a protector of the revolution and a man of significant professional influence. He believed that his loyalty was a physical shield that would protect him from any internal storm. He had a very specific habit of winding his silver pocket watch exactly 4 times every morning at 8 o'clock. He had performed this action every single day for the last 20 years, without failing a single time. He also kept a small notebook where he had written exactly 312 pages of a book on Marxist theory. He planned to finish the final chapter during his next summer vacation in the high mountain peaks. There were small details about him that seemed to have no function, but were a constant part of his presence in the office. He always carried a small piece of unpolished amber in his vest pocket that he had found on the banks of the Danube. He also had a tendency to tap his right foot in a rhythmic pattern whenever he was waiting for a phone call. He never noticed he was doing it, even during the most serious and formal meetings. He had once spent a month's salary on a rare fountain pen that he used only for signing official documents. He believed that the weight of the pen gave his signature a level of authority that a common pencil could never achieve. When he was eventually taken away, that pen was left on his desk next to a half-finished cup of coffee. These meaningless things would become the only evidence that a man had once occupied that space in the city. Alexandru lived in an apartment that was filled with the sounds of the busy city and the smell of fresh linden trees in the spring. He took a certain pride in the order of his books and the way his tailored suits hung in the dark mahogany closet. He saw his life as a steady climb toward a future that was defined by the success of the collective. He never imagined that his own history would be used as a weapon against his existence. The bank smelled of floor wax and the metallic scent of copper coins that had been handled by 1,000 hands. The light coming through the high windows was pale and dusty, casting long shadows across the velvet ropes. Every sensory detail in that building was designed to create an atmosphere of permanence and absolute safety for the depositors. The audience could not name what was wrong, but they could feel the pressure of the heavy camera lenses. The sound of the film reel spinning was a steady and mechanical hiss that filled the silent lobby of the bank. Alexandru felt the heat of the studio lights on the back of his neck as he moved toward the vault. The director was a man he had never met before, who spoke in short and clipped commands from the shadows. The world outside the bank felt distant and unreachable, as the cameras continued to roll through the afternoon. Alexandru knew every inch of the bank's layout because he had visited the branch as a regular customer for over a decade. He felt the weight of the prop gun in his hand and the sweat beginning to pool under his starched white collar. The reality of the scene felt distorted, as if he were walking through a dream where the rules of physics no longer applied. He saw the tellers watching him with eyes that contained no fear but a deep and hollow pity. A few weeks before the filming began, Alexandru noticed that his office phone had developed a faint and rhythmic clicking sound during his calls. He would hear it every few minutes, a small electronic pulse that suggested another ear was on the line. He paused for a second and then told himself it was likely just the aging infrastructure of the city. He made the active decision to keep talking as if everything were entirely normal and secure. He chose to ignore the fact that his brother-in-law, the Minister of the Interior, had stopped returning his personal messages. He convinced himself that the party was simply busy with the upcoming national holiday preparations and that his standing was secure. He dismissed the feeling of unease as nothing more than the stress of his workload. He decided to trust in the long history of his service to the state for 15 years in the underground. The actual event had occurred a month earlier when a branch of the National Bank was robbed of 1.6 million lei. This was an unheard-of crime in a totalitarian state where every movement was monitored by the secret police. The authorities quickly arrested Alexandru and 5 of his closest intellectual associates. They were accused of being the masterminds behind the greatest heist in the history of the country while the money was missing. The points of the incident were fast and cold, as the 6 men were taken to a secret facility for questioning. They were not given a chance to call a lawyer or speak to their families before the interrogations began. The voice of the investigators was devoid of any emotion as they described the evidence that they claimed to have found. The men were told that their only hope for mercy was to cooperate with a special state project for the cameras. The project was a film titled Reconstruction, which was intended to serve as a propaganda piece for the entire nation. The 6 intellectuals were forced to star in the movie and reenact the very robbery they were accused of committing. They were given a script and told that if they performed their roles perfectly, the state would show them mercy. They were led back to the bank under the heavy guard of the secret police for the first scene. Totalitarianism requires not just the death of the dissident, but their public participation in their own disgrace. The film was produced to ensure that the victim's final act on earth served the state that was killing them. The state converted a political execution into a cold and factual demonstration of absolute power, stopped completely. Alexandru initially clung to the old frame of reference that this was a bizarre legal maneuver to clear their names. He applied his logical mind to the script, trying to make the movements look realistic for the camera. He believed that if he followed the instructions of the director, he would be returned to his office and his life. He performed the robbery with the same precision he once used for his Marxist philosophy and party records. However, as the filming entered its second week, his logic began to fail and his decisions became instinctual. He realized that the script was not a recreation of a crime, but a meticulously crafted confession for the public. The questions from the director became more aggressive, and the physical pressure from the guards increased. Alexandru shifted from playing a part to trying to survive the weight of the studio lights in the dark bank. He realized that he had misread the nature of the situation from the very beginning of the arrest. It was not a robbery case, but a political purge that required a dramatic and public conclusion. The money was only a pretext to remove high-ranking Jewish members from the party leadership. Alexandru felt a sudden and sharp realization that the cameras were recording his own death warrant while he stood by the open vault of the National Bank. The goal of the investigation was not to find the missing money, but to make the perceived guilt of the intellectuals grow larger. Each new scene they filmed simultaneously answered a public question and opened a new and much larger mystery. The voice of the production grew colder as the final scenes were completed in the studio. The reconstruction of the crime was a report written in the blood of the men on the screen for the world to see. The first 5% of the investigation focused on the initial suspicions and the first hypotheses of a simple criminal gang. These theories were reasonable and completely wrong as they ignored the political reality of the era. The remaining 11% of the case was built from the fragments of the film and the testimony of the bank employees. Every piece of information made the central question of the state's motive much larger. The investigators found that the money from the original robbery had never actually entered the banking system of the country. Rumors persisted that the funds were stolen by the secret police themselves and blamed on the intellectuals to provide a reason for the purge. Each new piece of evidence gathered from the bank only made the silence of the state look more like a crime. They were holding the proof of a staged operation against their own. The forensic team analyzed the footage of the film and noted that the men seemed to be under extreme psychological distress. The shadows under their eyes and the tremor in their hands were not part of the original script. The experts realized that the movie was a document of a slow-motion execution that was being hidden in plain sight. Every frame captured the desperation of men who had run out of exits and logic in a country of shadows. The twist in the case did not just surprise the public, but reinterpreted the meaning of every scene in the film. What was treated as a way to ensure survival, the act of participating in the reenactment, was actually the final piece of evidence needed for their execution. Heard from the beginning, the listener now sees that the signs were already there in the silence of the minister and the clicking on the phone line. You are Alexandru Ionid. The studio lights are a blinding white heat that makes the sweat sting your eyes as you hold the prop gun. You feel the eyes of the armed guards in the shadows who are waiting for the scene to end. You see the director gesturing for you to move faster for the rolling cameras. Do you play the part to protect your family? Or do you stop and tell the truth? The climax was fast and cold as the final take was approved and the lights were turned off in the studio. There was no explanation and no further instructions given to the men as they were led back to their cells. The silence that followed the end of the filming was more deafening than any command from the guards. The intellectuals were taken to the execution wall just a few days after the film was developed for the state and the public. 5 of the 6 members of the gang were executed by firing squad in a secret location outside the city. The government issued a verdict that was a completed fact with no room for sympathy or emotion. The money was never recovered, and the details of the robbery remained a disputed state secret for decades. The state had effectively erased its political rivals while creating a macabre piece of cinematic propaganda for the entire nation. The propaganda film reconstruction still exists today as one of the most disturbing artifacts of the Cold War era. It is analyzed by film historians who look at the faces of the men and see the truth they were trying to hide. The bank remains in the center of Bucharest, and the marble floors are still polished to a mirror finish. That ordinariness is where the real horror of the state theater continues to live for the public in the present day. The truth is often a script that is written by those who have the power to define the roles we play. We believe that we can distinguish reality from a stage by the weight of our decisions and the logic of our actions. But sometimes the most terrifying theater is the one where the actors are the only ones who know the ending. The blinding lights of the studio are a reminder that the state can be the ultimate director in a world of shadows. The lights of the Bucharest bank went dark, leaving behind only the spin of a film reel and the memory of a prop gun. But as we move from the propaganda sets of Romania into the sun-drenched courtyards of Cyprus, we find another kind of tragedy. It was not the calculation of a state purge, but the sudden zip of a bullet in a dirty war. We move from the studio into the Mediterranean dust of a child's garden near a colonial barracks. There, the danger was not a scripted role, but a moment of panic in a land that was tired of empire. A 2-year-old girl was playing among the cats, while the world outside her gate was burning with insurgency. We leave the intellectuals of the city and move toward a weathered headstone in a courtyard. The smell of studio lights is replaced by the scent of dry earth and the silence of a tragedy that has no name and no simple resolution. In 1956, in the coastal town of Kyrenia, Cyprus, a 2-year-old girl named Jane Christian sat in a sun-drenched Mediterranean courtyard. She was arranging small white stones around a plastic doll that lay on its back in the dust. The air was heavy with the scent of dry earth and jasmine from the garden wall. This was a normal and peaceful moment of childhood. She reached out to move a stone when a sudden movement in the shadows of the doorway caught her eye. 5 feet away from her feet, a British soldier's wool beret lay abandoned in the dirt. It was flipped upside down, the metal badge reflecting the harsh afternoon sun into the corners of the porch. No one was around to pick it up or explain why it was there. Jane was a child who loved the small silver locket her mother had fastened around her neck when she turned 2. She would often touch the cold metal when she was thinking or when she felt a bit lonely in the garden. She had a habit of stroking the engraving on the front exactly 3 times before she started to play. It was her most prized and valuable possession. She also spent much of her time chasing the local street cats that would sun themselves on the low stone walls of the barracks. She knew each of them by the patterns on their fur and would often leave small scraps of meat near the gate. She believed that the cats were her guardians while her father was away on his daily patrols in the center of the town. Her father was Sergeant Christian, a man who had dedicated 15 years of his life to the service of the British Empire. He was a professional soldier who viewed his role as a necessary anchor of order in a land that was becoming increasingly volatile. He trusted in the strength of the barracks and the absolute protection of the military structures. He was known throughout the unit for the mirror shine he maintained on his black leather boots every single morning. He would spend exactly 20 minutes using a small brush and a soft cloth until he could see his own reflection in the toe. He believed that this level of discipline was the only thing that separated a soldier from a common civilian. Christian was a man who found comfort in the predictability of the army routine and the clear chain of command. He felt that as long as he followed the orders of his superiors, his family would remain safe within the colonial outpost. He saw the British flag as a physical barrier that the local insurgents would never be able to cross or even challenge. He often spoke to his wife about their dream of returning to a quiet cottage in the English countryside once his service ended. They had already saved exactly £4,000 toward the purchase of a small plot of land near the coast. That dream was the primary motivation for every long patrol he conducted in the heat of the Mediterranean sun. The house where they lived in Kyrenia was a sanctuary of sensory memories from their life back home in London. The smell of Earl Grey tea and the sound of a small radio playing the BBC World Service created a bubble of safety. Every detail was meant to remind them of the world they would eventually return to when the current conflict was finally over. He had a habit of tapping his wedding ring against the wooden desk in his office whenever he was reviewing the daily reports. He would strike the wood 3 times in a quick rhythm that his subordinates had come to recognize as a sign of his deep concentration. He did not even know he was doing it as he planned the security for the local village. In early 1956, a small but undeniable warning sign appeared in the neighborhood where the military families lived. A heavy rock was thrown through a neighbor's window in the middle of the night, wrapped in a note written in Greek. The message was a direct threat against the presence of the British forces and their families in the town. Sergeant Christian looked at the broken glass and the note and decided that it was likely just the work of a few radicalized youths. He convinced himself that the local EOKA rebels were too focused on the military targets to ever harm a woman or a child. He made the active decision to treat the incident as a minor act of vandalism and moved on quickly. He believed his own status and the proximity of the barracks would act as a deterrent against any real act of violence. He told his wife that the situation was under control and that there was no reason to change their daily routines in the garden. He chose to ignore the way the shopkeepers in the market had stopped making eye contact with the patrol. The afternoon of the incident was particularly quiet as the sun baked the white stones of the courtyard where Jane was playing. The only sound was the rhythmic clicking of her stones against the pavement as she arranged her doll's world. Sergeant Christian was inside the house, finishing a letter to his parents about their plans for the coming winter. Suddenly, the peaceful silence was broken by the sharp and distinct zip of a bullet cutting through the hot air. It was a small and precise sound that seemed to carry no weight until it was followed by a dull thud against the garden wall. Jane's laughter stopped instantly and was replaced by a silence that felt more deafening than any explosion. Sergeant Christian dropped his pen and ran toward the garden with a speed he had only used in the middle of a battle. He saw the plastic doll lying face down in the dust, its white dress stained with a sudden and deep crimson. He reached for his daughter, but his limbs felt heavy and slow as the reality of the scene began to sink into his mind. In a conflict defined by insurgency, the distinction between a combatant and a civilian is often erased by a single moment of panic. A 2-year-old child became a casualty of a war she was not old enough to understand or even name. The colonial government used the death to justify the brutal interrogations of the local village for several weeks. The local military police immediately blamed the EOKA rebels for the shooting, claiming it was a cold-blooded sniper attack. They argued that the insurgents were trying to force a British withdrawal by targeting the most vulnerable members of the families. This was the only investigative direction that the state was willing to pursue at the time. Sergeant Christian sat in the barracks and watched as the officers led groups of local men away for questioning in the cells. He wanted to believe that the killers had been found and that justice would be served for the loss of his daughter. He held the small silver locket in his hand and waited for a name that would explain the zip of the bullet. However, the reconstruction of the event from the fragments of the scene began to open new and much larger questions for the family. A secret witness from a nearby house claimed that the shot did not come from the rooftops of the rebels. They reported seeing a British patrol opening fire indiscriminately into a crowd that was moving toward the gate. The autopsy report for Jane Christian was kept under the highest level of classification by the colonial government for several decades. It showed that the caliber of the bullet was identical to the ammunition issued to the British soldiers on duty that day. The trajectory suggested that the shot came from the street level rather than from a height. Each new piece of information simultaneously answered an old question and opened a new and much darker possibility for the sergeant. He realized that the investigative direction he had trusted was designed to protect the reputation of the army. The voice of the official report was growing colder and more distant with every passing week of the case. The most disturbing detail was the British soldier's beret that had been found lying in the dust of the courtyard near the body. It did not belong to Sergeant Christian or any of the rescuers who had arrived after the shooting was already over. It was a standard-issue wool cap that appeared to have been dropped by someone who was running away in a panic. The twist in the case did not just surprise the family, but reinterpreted the meaning of every action taken by the military that day. The tool meant to ensure the survival of the child, the British patrol in the street, was actually the cause of the tragedy. The sergeant now saw that all the signs of institutional panic had been present in the unit. The soldier who had dropped his beret was likely a young recruit who had fired his weapon in a moment of extreme stress and confusion. He had seen a movement in the garden and reacted without thinking, hitting the only target that was visible to him. He had fled the scene to avoid the consequences of his mistake while the rebels were being blamed. Sergeant Christian was left to pick up his daughter's body in a land that hated his presence and his uniform with an equal intensity. He realized that the institutional silence was a physical barrier that he could never hope to break with his rank. He was a man who had lost his daughter to the very system he had dedicated 15 years of his life to. No one was ever charged with the murder of Jane Christian, and the case remains officially unsolved in the archives of the Cyprus police. The colonial government eventually withdrew from the island, leaving behind a legacy of a dirty war that had no clear winners. The silence of the courtyard was a testament to the fact that children are never safe. A small and weathered headstone marks the spot in Kyrenia where Jane was buried under the Mediterranean sun. It is a simple marker that bears only her name and the date of her death in 1956. The stone is often covered in a fine layer of dust from the surrounding hills, making it difficult for a stranger to read the words in the light. The dream of the English cottage and the saved money were eventually used to pay for a funeral and a ticket back to London. Sergeant Christian never polished his boots to a mirror shine again after he left the barracks for the last time. Ordinary objects like a child's doll lying in the dust are where the real horror of the crossfire continues to live. The borders of an empire are often drawn with the blood of the innocent and the silence of the officials who watched it happen. We believe that our uniforms and our titles provide us with a layer of safety that the rest of the world must respect. But in a land of insurgency, the only thing that is certain is that a moment of panic can change a life. The dust of Kyrenia eventually settled, leaving behind only the echo of a single shot and the memory of a plastic doll. But as we move from the dry courtyards of Cyprus into the gray cliffs of Lima, Peru, we find a different kind of tragedy. There, the ground was not a site of crossfire, but a stage for a judicial murder of a man named Jorge Villanueva. We move from the Mediterranean sun into the sharp, salty spray of the Pacific Ocean where a child's shoe was found on a ledge. In that city, the danger was not a panicked soldier, but a legal system that was hungry for a scapegoat to satisfy a crowd. The air of the Armendariz cliffs would soon carry the sound of a firing squad in the gray light of dawn. September 1954. Lima, Peru. 3-year-old Julio Hidalgo was playing in the dirt near his family home. The city was covered in its usual gray blanket of coastal fog known as the garua. It was a Tuesday, and the neighborhood was alive with the sound of merchants and traffic. Then a single white shoe was found resting on the edge of the jagged Armendariz cliffs. Jorge Villanueva Torres was a 35-year-old Afro-Peruvian street vendor. He had worked the same corner in the Barranco district for over 5 years. He was known for his steady pace and his quiet voice when calling out his wares to the passing crowds. He lived a life of routine and physical labor that most people simply chose to ignore every single day in the city. He carried a small wooden box of candy and cigarettes that weighed exactly 4 kilograms when full. Every evening he would count his coins and place them into a glass jar hidden under his bed. He had saved exactly 1,200 sols over the last 2 years. He wanted to buy a new wool coat to protect himself from the damp winter air that rolled in from the Pacific. Jorge spent his mornings walking from his small room to the market to buy his daily supplies of sweets and tobacco. He walked exactly 4 kilometers every day, regardless of the weather or the pain in his legs from the uneven streets. He knew every merchant by their first name, and he always greeted them with a polite nod and a small smile for the day. His wooden display box was a master class in organization and careful management of small resources. He arranged the cigarette packs by brand and price, ensuring that the most popular ones were always within easy reach for the busy workers. He kept a small piece of velvet cloth inside the box that he used to wipe away the city dust every hour in the afternoon. The souls he saved were not just coins to him, but were the physical evidence of his endurance and his hope for the future. He would count them every Sunday afternoon while sitting by his single window that overlooked a small courtyard. He never spent a single coin on himself, choosing to eat the simplest meals of bread and tea to keep his savings intact. Jorge also carried a small tin of peppermint oil that he used to soothe his throat after a long day of calling out his wares. He would apply exactly 2 drops to his tongue before he went to sleep every night without fail. He also had a habit of checking the latch on his door 3 times to ensure his savings were safe from the thieves in the district. The garua fog of Lima carried the smell of damp wool, fried dough, and the sharp tang of the Pacific salt spray. It was a sensory environment that felt both heavy and protective to the people who lived under its gray weight for months at a time. The sound of the church bells provided a rhythmic structure to the day that everyone in the Barranco district respected. He often sat on a specific stone bench near the entrance to the park to watch the children play during their lunch break. He enjoyed the sound of their laughter and the way they ran through the grass without a care in the world. He would sometimes offer a small candy to a child who looked particularly sad, always asking for their parents' permission first. The dream of the wool coat was more than just a matter of physical comfort for a man who worked outside in the damp air. To Jorge, the coat represented his transition from a struggling street vendor to a man of established standing in the district. He could almost feel the weight of the warm wool against his shoulders at night when the temperature dropped. He had once helped a neighbor repair a leaking roof during a particularly bad storm without asking for any payment in return. He spent exactly 4 hours working in the rain because he believed that neighbors should always look out for one another. This act of kindness was typical for Jorge, though he never spoke about it to anyone else in the local market. Every sensory detail of his daily path was etched into his memory with the precision of an engineer's blueprint. The smell of the roasting coffee at the corner and the sound of the old woman sweeping her porch were the markers of his safety. He believed that as long as he followed his routine and stayed within the familiar streets, he would be protected. The Barranco district was a place where the history of the city was carved into the old stone walls and the wooden balconies. Jorge loved the way the late afternoon light would turn the fog into a golden haze for a few brief minutes before the sun set. He would pause his work for that single moment and simply breathe in the cool air of the coastal evening. He had a small collection of books in his room that he had gathered over several years from the used stalls in the center. He spent his evenings slowly teaching himself to read by the light of a single kerosene lamp on his table. He had managed to finish exactly 3 chapters of a history book in the last month alone. This was his most valuable luxury. The audience for his daily calls was a mix of laborers, office clerks, and mothers who were out for their morning shopping. He knew the specific brands of cigarettes each of them preferred and would have their order ready before they even reached his stand. He saw these interactions as a form of social contract that was built on mutual respect and reliability. The first warning sign appeared on a Friday evening when a local boy did not return home for his dinner at 6 o'clock. His mother searched the narrow streets and called his name into the deepening fog, but only the wind from the sea answered her. A local witness reported seeing a dark-skinned man walking near the cliffs earlier that afternoon in the city. Jorge noticed that the atmosphere in the market had changed the next morning as people began to whisper and point at him from a distance. He felt the sudden coldness in the air and the way the merchants avoided his eyes when he walked past their stalls. He dismissed the feeling as his own imagination and decided to stick to his routine as he always did. The central incident began when the body of the young boy was discovered at the base of the Armendariz cliffs 3 days later. The news sent a wave of shock through the entire population of Lima that was fueled by the sensational media reports. The newspapers immediately began using the term Negro torpedo to describe a hypothetical suspect without any evidence. The arrest of Jorge Villanueva was fast and cold as the police arrived at his corner in the middle of a busy afternoon. They did not present any warrant or explain the charges as they threw his display box into the street and handcuffed his wrists. The crowd watched in silence as the vendor was led away to a waiting black sedan near the park in the district. The station was a maze of gray walls and the smell of stale coffee and old floor wax that felt like a tomb to the vendor. He was placed in a windowless room and interrogated for 20 hours without the presence of a lawyer or a single glass of water. The police showed him the boy's white shoe and told him that his life was already over if he did not confess. Jorge initially believed that the truth of his daily routine would act as a shield against the accusations being leveled at him. He explained to the detectives that he had been working his corner all day and had dozens of regular customers who could prove his alibi. He applied the logic of his honest life to the situation, assuming the law would find the killer. However, his logic failed as he realized the police were not interested in his alibi or the statements of his witnesses. He saw the detectives mocking his voice and his race, while they wrote down statements he had never actually made during the night. His decisions shifted from reasoning to pure survival instinct as he sat in the cold and dark cell in the station. He realized that he had misread the nature of the situation from the very beginning of the arrest in the market. It was not a criminal investigation, but a political necessity that required a dramatic and public conclusion to calm the people. Jorge felt a sudden and sharp realization that the legal system was being used as a weapon against his existence. Between the arrest and the trial, there was a brief breath where the situation appeared to stabilize for a few days in the news. A young lawyer named Carlos Enrique Melgar agreed to take the case for free to ensure a fair hearing for the street vendor. But the underlying pressure of the media hysteria continued to grow until the stability was revealed as an illusion. The goal of the investigation was not to find the truth, but to make the perceived guilt of the vendor grow larger in the public eye. Initial hypotheses about a local predator were quickly discarded in favor of a more convenient narrative for the state. This direction was simple and reasonable to a population that was already primed with racial prejudice. Institutional racism in 1950s Peru functioned as a blindfold that effectively prevented the law from seeing anything but a convenient scapegoat. An innocent man was eventually tied to a wooden stake because his face matched the city's pre-existing prejudice and hunger for a public execution. Stop completely. Reconstruction from the fragments of the scene revealed that the boy's injuries were inconsistent with the theory of a violent struggle. There were no fingerprints on the body, and no traces of Jorge's clothing were found at the jagged edge of the cliff. The timeline showed that Jorge would have had to be in 2 places at once to commit the act that day. The lead detective later admitted under pressure that no one had bothered to check the fingerprints on the boy's white shoe. The testimony of the primary witness was found to be contradictory and had been gathered under extreme coercion from the police officers. Despite these massive flaws, the regional prosecutor moved forward with the capital charges. The defense was given only a few hours to prepare for a trial that would decide a man's life or death in the city. The judge was reported to have slept through much of the testimony, and he frequently interrupted the defense lawyer during his closing argument. The atmosphere in the courtroom was one of a carnival where the outcome was already known to everyone. The twist in the case did not just surprise the legal team, but reinterpreted the meaning of every headline in the newspapers. The tool meant to ensure the survival of the innocent, the Peruvian judicial system, was actually the primary cause of the tragedy. Heard from the beginning, the listener now sees that all the signs were already there in the silence. The real killer was likely a local predator who vanished into the coastal fog while the city focused its hatred on the vendor. He may have stood in the very back of the crowd during the execution, watching as the rifles were leveled at the wrong man. No one looked for him because they were too busy watching the firing squad perform its duty in the gray dawn. You are Jorge Villanueva Torres right now. The salt spray of the Pacific is cold on your skin, and the wooden stake at your back is rough against your spine. You see the line of rifles being raised in the gray light of dawn, and their barrels are leveled at your chest. You feel the breath hitching in your throat as you realize the crowd isn't looking for the truth. Jorge Villanueva was executed by a firing squad in 1957, while he was still maintaining his innocence to the end. He died with his mother's photograph in his pocket, and his savings jar was still hidden under his bed. The government issued a brief verdict that was a completed fact with no room for further appeals or questions in the city. Decades later, a judicial review admitted that the trial had been a travesty of justice and that there was no physical evidence of guilt. Jorge was posthumously declared a judicial martyr, and his case is now used to teach the dangers of tunnel vision in police work. The jagged cliffs of Armendariz are still there, overlooking the gray sea and the salt spray. The law is only as just as the people who choose to look past their own shadows to see the light of the truth. We believe that our systems are built to protect us from the monsters that hide in the dark alleys, but sometimes the real monster is the one that wears a uniform and holds a rifle in the name of the state. It is a truth that remains for everyone. The salt spray of Lima remained behind like a cold reminder of a life that was taken by the law. But as we move from the open cliffs of Peru into the boarding of a house in Mexico City, we find a different kind of imprisonment. It was not the fear of a state execution, but the terror of a domestic prison. We move from the Pacific into the castle of purity. In 1959, on the bustling Insurgentes Avenue in Mexico City, the morning sun reflected off the windows of the modern shops. The sidewalks were crowded with professionals heading to their offices, and the sound of traffic was a constant hum against the buildings. It was a typical day in a city that was rapidly moving toward a bright and connected future. A large stone house stood on a prominent corner of the avenue, appearing from the outside to be a silent relic of a different era. While the surrounding buildings were open to the street, this house was a fortress of absolute and heavy privacy. Every single window on the upper and lower floors was covered by thick wooden planks that were nailed into the stone. The only connection between the interior of the house and the busy world outside was a single, tiny peephole drilled through the center of one plank. This hole was perfectly round and offered a limited view of the pedestrians walking past the iron gate. To the thousands of people who passed by every day, it was just a strange detail on a decaying piece of property. Rafael Perez Hernandez was the owner of the house and a man who believed that the outside world was a source of moral filth and decay. He was a manufacturer of rat poison, and he operated his small business entirely from within the walls of his home. He was a man of cold and rigid discipline, who saw himself as the only protector of his large family. He spent exactly 40 minutes every morning polishing his heavy leather belt buckle until it shone like a mirror in the dim light. He also maintained a meticulous ledger, where he recorded every single calorie that was consumed by his wife and their 6 children. He believed that control over the body was the first step toward achieving a state of total purity. Rafael had kept his family inside the house for 18 years without allowing them to step foot on a public sidewalk or see a park. He had brought his wife Sonia into the home when they were married, and she had not seen the sun since 1941. He viewed his isolation not as a form of imprisonment, but as a sacred and necessary duty. His occupation as a poison manufacturer required him to maintain a constant supply of chemical powders and heavy mixing equipment in the back rooms. He used his 6 children as his primary workforce, teaching them to pack the lethal dust into small paper bags. He trusted in the silence of his family because he had raised them to fear everything outside. He had a habit of checking the locks on the front door exactly 3 times before he went to sleep at night. He had spent exactly 12,000 hours of his life lecturing his children on the dangers of the modern world and the necessity of their isolation. He never raised his voice, preferring a tone that was as steady and cold as a winter morning. Indomita was his eldest daughter, and she had spent her entire life within the confines of the boarded-up rooms and the courtyard. She had a small habit of tapping the wooden table 3 times whenever she heard a car horn honking on the avenue outside. She also kept a piece of blue glass she had found in the dirt as her only connection to the sky. The air inside the house was thick with the acrid and choking scent of the chemical powders used to create the rat poison. The sound of the children's rhythmic breathing as they worked was the only thing that filled the windowless production room. Every sensory detail in the house was designed to make the children feel that the world was a small and dusty space. The children were named with words that ironically represented the freedom they were being denied by their own father. Indomita and her brother Libre had never been to a school or spoken to a person who did not live within their stone walls. They understood the concept of a street only through the stories their father told them to keep them in fear. One morning in 1959, Indomita noticed a small gap between 2 of the planks on a side window that faced a narrow alley. She watched the light filtering through the crack and felt a sudden and sharp impulse to reach out to the world. She found a discarded bread bag on the floor and a small pencil that her father had left on the table. She spent 20 minutes writing a short and desperate note on the brown paper, begging for someone to call the authorities to the house. She waited until she heard her father moving toward the kitchen before she shoved the note through the small gap. She watched it fall into the dust of the alley, and then she quickly returned to her work. The first warning sign appeared when a passerby found the note but dismissed it as a prank from a local schoolchild. They looked at the boarded-up house and decided that it was likely just a storage facility for the rat poison business. They chose to ignore the feeling of unease and moved on toward the market without saying a word to the local police. Indomita noticed that her father was becoming increasingly paranoid about the sounds of the city encroaching on their private sanctuary. He began to nail additional boards over the existing planks to ensure that no light could ever penetrate the interior. He convinced himself that he was staying ahead of the corruption that was trying to enter his home. The central incident occurred when Indomita decided that she would not survive another year of breathing the chemical dust in the dark. She wrote a 2nd and 3rd note, dropping them through the gap whenever she heard footsteps in the alleyway. She was no longer thinking about her father's rules, but was acting on the raw instinct to stay alive. A local woman eventually picked up the 3rd note and read the words that described 18 years of domestic imprisonment and child labor. She looked up at the boarded windows and felt a sudden chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. She walked directly to the nearest police station and handed the paper bag to the officer on duty. The police arrived at the house on Insurgentes Avenue with a warrant and a team of men equipped with heavy crowbars. They forced the front door open and were hit by a wave of chemical odors that made them gag in the hallway. They found a woman and 6 children who were so pale they appeared to be made of stone in the dim light. Reconstruction of the house revealed a series of cells where the children were forced to sleep on thin mats on the floor. The investigators found Raphael sitting at his desk, perfectly calm, as if he were waiting for a routine business meeting to begin. He offered the officers a glass of water and spoke about the importance of purity in a decaying city. The secret to his control was not metal bars or chains, but a psychological barrier that he had built using 18 years of calculated lies. He had convinced his children that the outside world would kill them instantly if they ever tried to breathe the air. He was a narcissist who used the concept of safety as a weapon against his own family. The state-sponsored school system had no record of the children ever existing, and the neighbors had no idea there were people inside. A family was buried in plain sight on a major avenue, while the city continued to move around them every single day. The children were found to be severely malnourished and unable to understand the basic concept of a sidewalk. Every sensory detail of the raid was captured in the forensic reports and the testimony of the officers on the scene. The smell of the rat poison and the sound of the boards being ripped away were the markers of the family's liberation. The authorities realized that the house was a factory designed to consume the lives of the people who lived inside. You are in Domita right now. The air in the room is thick with the acrid and choking dust of rat poison, and your lungs feel like they are being coated in glass. You see your mother's face, pale and hollowed by years of silence, as she watches you approach the gap. You feel the rough paper of the bag in your hand as you hear your father's footsteps. Do you wait for the sound of the heavy boots to fade down the hallway so you can be sure of your safety? Or do you shove the note through the crack right now, betting that a stranger is passing by the alley at this exact second? The choice must be made before the boards are doubled and the light from the outside world is gone from your life forever. The twist in the case was the discovery that Raphael was not actually protecting his family from a corrupt world. He was using their labor to fund his own private lifestyle, while he frequently left the house to enjoy the city he claimed to hate. The purity he preached was a lie he used to keep his workers from ever demanding their own freedom or pay. Rafael Perez Hernandez was arrested and sentenced to several years in a state prison for the crimes against his wife and children. He maintained his innocence until the end, claiming that he was a victim of a society that did not value the sanctity of the home. The case became a landmark in Mexican law regarding the nature of domestic abuse. The house was eventually demolished, and the boards were sold as scrap metal to a local construction company. The children were taken to a rehabilitation center, where they spent years learning how to interact with a world they had only seen through a peephole. They struggled to walk on the open streets without feeling the fear their father had planted. Sonia and her children eventually moved to a small town where they could live without the shadow of the boards or the smell of the poison. Indomita kept her piece of blue glass as a reminder of the day she decided to reach for the sky. These ordinary people were left to rebuild their lives in the light of a world they were told did not exist. The truth of a home is often hidden behind the walls that were built to keep the rest of the world at a distance. We believe that we are safe within our own families, and that the people we love have our best interests in mind. But sometimes the most dangerous place on earth is the one where the windows are nailed shut in the name of purity. The house on Insurgentes is gone, leaving behind only the memory of a single peephole and a note on a paper bag. The story of the Castle of Purity remains a testament to the resilience of the human spirit in the face of absolute control. The light of the sun is a physical force that eventually finds its way through even the smallest and darkest gap. Tonight, I have shared 10 true stories with you about the dark history of the 1950s. Each of them is a reminder that the world is a complex and often dangerous place where the truth is rarely simple. If you enjoyed these stories and want to hear more about the mysteries of the past, make sure you have subscribed to the channel. In July of 1951, in the ancient city of Jerusalem, the sun beat down on the limestone walls of the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Inside the vast prayer hall, the air was cool and smelled of century-old dust and expensive incense. Worshippers moved with a quiet reverence as they prepared for the start of the Friday afternoon service. King Abdullah I of Jordan walked toward the front of the congregation with his usual slow and steady gait. He was followed closely by his 16-year-old grandson who watched the floor as they moved. However, as the king reached the marble columns, a young man in the crowd stood up and held a heavy object under his starched white shirt. The king was 69 years old and had spent his entire life navigating the treacherous waters of Middle Eastern politics. He was a man of built-in contradictions who trusted in the divine protection of the holy site above all else. He believed that the sanctity of the mosque was a physical barrier that no person would ever dare to violate. He was a man of very specific habits and numbers that defined the rhythm of his public and private duties. He had participated in exactly 47 official state ceremonies in the last year alone, each one meticulously planned. He wore a gold-trimmed robe that had been tailored to his exact measurements by a specialized craftsman in the city of Amman. Abdullah was currently in the final stages of a secret project to establish a lasting peace treaty within the region. He kept a leather-bound journal where he had written exactly 82 pages of notes on the proposed borders and agreements. He He planned to announce the first draft of the treaty during the upcoming national holiday celebrations. There were small details about him that served no plot function, but were constant parts of his daily presence. He always carried a small silver snuff box that had been a gift from a foreign leader decades earlier. He also had a tendency to smooth his gray beard 3 times whenever he was about to deliver a formal speech to the people. He never explained why he always touched the silver box before he entered a room, or why that specific count of 3 mattered. These meaningless quirks were the human elements of a ruler who was otherwise seen as a distant and powerful figure. When he eventually collapsed on the marble floor, these small things would be the most painful memories. The king took a certain pride in the order and the discipline of his royal guard, who surrounded him at all times. He knew the names of each man and would often ask about their families during the long drives between the cities. He saw himself as the father of a young nation that was still trying to find its own identity. His grandson, Prince Hussein, stood directly to his left and matched the king's pace with a focused and quiet intensity. The boy had been trained to watch the crowd for any signs of trouble, though he was only 16 years old. He felt the weight of the medals on his own uniform and the responsibility of the royal lineage. The prayer hall was a sanctuary of sensory extremes, where the heat of the Jerusalem sun was replaced by a cold stone stillness. The sound of the worshippers shifting on the rugs was the only thing that could be heard in the vast space. Every sensory detail was designed to place the visitor inside a feeling of total and permanent security. The smell of the incense and the sight of the light filtering through the high windows created an atmosphere of absolute peace. The audience could not name what felt wrong, but they could feel the pressure of the silence as the king approached the altar. The boy felt the cool air of the mosque against his skin and the weight of his boots. The king reached his designated place and prepared to bow his head for the first prayer of the afternoon service. He felt the presence of his grandson behind him and the familiar scent of the old stone walls around them. He believed that, as long as he stayed within the holy site, he was beyond the reach of his enemies. A few minutes before the service began, the king noticed a young man in the 3rd row who was staring at him. The stranger was a tailor named Mustafa Ashu, and he was not moving his lips with the rest of the congregation. The king paused for a second, and then told himself it was likely just a nervous pilgrim from the country. He chose to ignore the way the young man's hand was trembling beneath the fabric of his shirt as he sat there. He convinced himself that the royal guards would have spotted any real threat long before he entered the hall. He made the active decision to proceed with the prayers, and he looked away from the stranger and the crowd. The central incident occurred with a speed and a violence that shattered the sacred silence of the Al-Aqsa Mosque forever. Mustafa Ashu lunged forward from his place in the congregation and drew a pistol from beneath his starched shirt. There was no conversation and no hesitation as the young man leveled the weapon at the king's chest. A single shot echoed through the stone halls with the thunderous crack of a physical explosion in the silent space. The bullet struck King Abdullah at point-blank range, and the force of the impact sent him backward onto the marble. The gold-trimmed robe was suddenly stained with a crimson that pooled on the white stone of the floor. The narrative voice must remain cold, as the event speaks for itself, without the need for emotional or dramatic adjectives. The actual event was the point of no return for the royal family and the trajectory of the entire Middle East. After this moment, the prince no longer had the option of not believing in the lethality of the world. As the king fell, the gunman turned his weapon toward the 16-year-old prince, who was standing in shock. The boy saw the barrel of the pistol and felt the sudden rush of air as a second shot was fired. His logic failed him in that second, and his decisions were no longer thought-based but were driven by a raw and heavy instinct. Prince Hussein did not run or dive for cover as the bullet moved toward his chest in the middle of the hall. He realized in that split second that the nature of the situation had been misread by the royal guard and his grandfather. It was not a protest or a minor disturbance, but a coordinated and lethal assassination of the crown. Between the first and second shots, there was a brief breath where time seemed to slow down for everyone in the room. The guards began to draw their own weapons, but they were already too late to stop the first bullet from landing. The prince felt the cold air of the mosque and the sudden heat of the muzzle flash in his eyes. The boy felt a massive impact against his chest that knocked the wind out of his lungs and sent him stumbling back. He expected to feel the searing pain of the lead, but instead, he felt a hard and metallic vibration. He looked down and saw that the second bullet had hit the silver metal pinned to the front of his uniform. The investigation into the assassination began before the smoke from the pistol had even cleared from the rafters of the mosque. The goal was not just to capture the shooter, but to make the questions about the conspiracy grow larger. The initial hypotheses suggested a lone wolf acting out of religious or personal desperation in the city. This direction was simple and reasonable, but it was completely wrong, as the authorities soon discovered through the evidence. Reconstruction from the fragments of the shooter's life revealed ties to a powerful and disgruntled political family. Each new piece of testimony simultaneously answered an old question and opened a new and much darker one. The voice of the police grew colder as they realized the assassination was the result of a coordinated plan by 10 people. They found documents that suggested the killers feared a separate peace treaty with the neighboring state of Israel. Every piece of information made the central question of the regional stability much larger for the court. The investigators found that the shooters had been monitoring the king's schedule for weeks to find the perfect moment to strike. They chose the mosque because they knew the royal guards would be less vigilant during the moments of sacred prayer. The investigation had nothing to do with finding a motive and everything to do with the hit. The forensic team analyzed the silver medal that had saved the life of the future king of Jordan after the shooting. They found that the lead bullet had been deflected by the heavy metal and had lodged itself in a nearby pillar. The medal was a standard piece of military honors that had been given to the boy just a month earlier. The twist in the case did not just surprise the nation, but reinterpreted the meaning of every sign that had come before. What was treated as a symbol of tradition, the medal on the uniform, was actually the only tool that ensured survival. Heard from the beginning, the listener now sees that the tragedy was a matter of inches and timing. The conspirators believed that by killing the king, they would stop the peace treaty and protect their own political power. However, their act of violence only served to harden the resolve of the young prince who had watched his grandfather die. The trajectory of the nation was changed not by the assassin, but by the survivor of the hit. You are Prince Hussein right now. The stone floor of the mosque is cool beneath your feet, and the air is thick with the scent of incense and dust. You see a young man lunging toward your grandfather, and a metal glint reflecting off the marble. You feel the sudden and hot rush of air as the bullet grazes your chest and hits the metal. You are 16 years old, and you have just seen the world through the barrel of a pistol in a house of God. The gold-trimmed robe is crimson, and the silence of the prayer has been replaced by the sound of screams. Do you dive to cover the king? Or do you freeze as the first crack of the pistol echoes through the sacred and stone hall? King Abdullah I was declared dead on the marble floor of the Al-Aqsa Mosque on July 20th, 1951. He was 69 years old and left behind a kingdom that was suddenly on the verge of total collapse. The government issued a brief verdict that was a completed fact with no room for sympathy or emotion for the people. The 10 conspirators were caught and tried within a matter of weeks, and 4 of them were executed by the state for the crime. The gold-trimmed robe and the blood-stained carpet were removed from the mosque, and the site was eventually cleaned. These ordinary objects are the only physical evidence of the day the regional history shifted. The silver medal that saved the life of the future king is now displayed in the Royal Tank Museum in the city of Amman. It remains a symbol of survival and a reminder of the price of leadership in a land of constant and shifting borders. That ordinariness of a piece of metal is where the real horror of the assassination continues to live. The trajectory of a single projectile can rewrite the maps of a region and the destiny of a people in a second. We believe that our status and our sacred spaces provide us with a layer of safety that the world must respect. But in a place of shifting shadows, the only thing that is certain is that the wilderness never explains its choices. Close your eyes now and listen to the hum of the vacuum where time and space begin their long, slow dance across the velvet dark. You are made of pieces that once burned in the hearts of giants and drifted through the freezing silence of the deep. This is the story of how the heavy elements in your own blood were forged in fire, so bright it could blind the gods of old. Rest your head and let the gravity of this logic pull you down into the quiet. In the beginning, there is only the gas and the dust floating in a cradle of cold blue light where nothing ever moves too fast. Gravity is a patient mother who gathers the stray atoms of hydrogen and whispers for them to come closer until they touch. This gathering is not a violent act, but a soft accumulation of weight that grows until the center begins to glow with a heat that was never there before. You are part of this gathering, and you always will be. The pressure builds inside the core like a secret that can no longer be kept while the outer shell keeps the cold world at a distance. When the temperature reaches 10 million degrees, the hydrogen atoms stop resisting and melt into helium in a flash of pure intent. This is the birth of the light that travels across the empty miles to find your window and wake you from a dream. It is a steady heartbeat of fusion that balances the weight of the universe. A star is a lesson in balance between the inward pull of gravity and the outward push of the radiation that seeks to escape the cage. For billions of years, this equilibrium holds steady like a deep breath taken by a sleeping giant in the center of the galaxy. It is a state of grace where the energy flows in a rhythmic cycle that sustains the planets huddling in the warmth. You can feel this balance in your own lungs as the air moves in and out of the world. But even the longest breath must eventually reach its end as the hydrogen fuel begins to run thin in the deep wells of the core. The star swells into a red giant and reaches out with a soft heat to touch the worlds that once stayed far away. This expansion is a beautiful and quiet surrender to the laws of entropy that dictate all things must change their shape. The helium starts to burn, and heavier things like carbon and oxygen begin to form in the belly. Inside that swelling heat, the iron begins to settle like a heavy thought that cannot be moved or burned away by any fire. Iron is the limit of a star's ability to create life through fusion, because it takes more energy to build it than it gives back to the light. This is the point where the balance breaks, and the inward pull of gravity becomes a hunger that cannot be satisfied. The heart of the star realizes that it can no longer hold the weight of its own history. The collapse happens faster than a blink of a human eye as the iron core gives up and falls into itself with a crushing force. In that single second, the outer layers are pulled inward and then bounced off the center in a shock wave that lights up the entire sky. This is the supernova, and it is the only way the universe can share the treasures it has made in the dark. Gold and silver and lead are scattered like seeds into the wind of the cosmic vacuum. What remains is either a ghost of a white dwarf or the dense spinning heart of a neutron star that hums a lonely song. Or perhaps the gravity is so strong that it tears a hole in the fabric of time and becomes a black hole where light cannot go. But do not be afraid of the dark, because it is the place where the dust settles and waits to be gathered again by the next long breath. The cycle of the star is the cycle of your own memory, as it fades and returns. Every iron atom in your blood and every calcium bone in your frame was once part of that spectacular and ancient death. You are the byproduct of a celestial struggle that happened millions of light years away and millions of years before you were born. This is why the night sky feels so familiar to you and why you look up at the moon and see a friend. You are looking at your own origins reflected in the mirror of the deep and freezing cosmic void. Entropy is not a monster that eats the world, but a soft blanket that eventually covers all the fires to let them rest. It is the natural progression of energy from a high concentrated point to a wide and even distribution across the space. One day, the universe will be a quiet garden of cold embers, where the light has finally found its peace in every corner. This is not the end of the story, but the final movement of a symphony that has played for eras. Your own life follows this same analytical curve as you gather energy and build the structures of your mind and your heart. You fuse the experiences of your days into a heavy legacy that will eventually be shared with the people who come after you. Just like the star, you scatter your light and your elements into the world so that new lives can take root in the soil. You are a small sun in a vast system of connections that never truly breaks or ends. Time is only a measurement of how long it takes for the light to travel from one point of beauty to another in the dark. In the eyes of the cosmos, you are happening all at once in a flash of existence that is as significant as a supernova. The distance between the stars is only a space for the silence to wait and listen for your heartbeat in the night. Rest now, and let the physics of the universe hold you steady as you drift into the deep of sleep. Eventually, the heat will move away from the centers and find its home in the vast stretches of the empty and cold fields. This is the heat death of the universe, and it sounds like a soft exhale at the end of a very long and productive day. It is the moment when all the work is finished, and the gravity can finally let go of its burden of holding things together. The universe becomes a soft and uniform sea of potential, where nothing is lost or forgotten. Light is a messenger that carries the history of the dead stars across the miles so that you can read them in the night. It tells you that nothing is ever truly gone, but only changed into a different frequency that your eyes cannot yet see. You are a frequency of light that has taken a human form to witness the beauty of the cold and the heat of the fire. Every breath you take is a confirmation of the laws of thermodynamics that govern the entire sky. The universe is a closed system where no energy is ever created or destroyed, but only moved from one hand to another. This means that the warmth you feel in your hands right now is the same warmth that once powered a nebula in a distant arm. You are a vessel for the ancient fire that has survived the cooling of the eons to find a home in your pulse. This conservation of energy is the ultimate promise of the cosmos that you will always remain in some form. Let the analytical weight of this knowledge settle into your bones like a heavy and comforting stone at the bottom of a pool. Knowledge is a form of light that illuminates the path of your ancestors back to the very first spark of the flame. When you understand the fusion of the atoms, you understand the fusion of the souls that have walked this earth. There is no separation between the science of the stars and the poetry of your own heartbeat today. In the quietest part of the night, you can almost hear the soft clicking of the fundamental constants that hold reality in place. The speed of light and the strength of the nuclear force are the lullabies that the universe sings to keep itself stable. If these numbers were even a fraction different, the stars would never ignite and your heart would never beat. You are the result of a mathematical miracle that has been calculated across billions of miles. So sleep now and let the stars do the work of keeping the universe turning while you are away in the land of your dreams. The gravity is gentle, and the vacuum is kind, and the light will be there to greet you when the world turns back. You are a child of the supernova and a student of the dark, and you are safe in the arms of the physics that made you. The long dance continues, and you are exactly where you are meant to be